I see the term cultural Marxism a lot, usually from the crowd claiming that colleges are indoctrinating the youth into leftists and that wearing a mask for COVID-19 is tyrannical. The problem is that this term is complete and utter nonsense. This should not be taken as an attack on the average person that uses this phrase. These people are scared, and they've been deceived. The specter of communism has been looming over the West since the ideology's inception in Russia during World War I, and political ideologues have been using it as a boogeyman to smear their rivals whenever they get the chance. The Red Scare in the US has had varying levels of prominence since the Russian Communist Revolution, such as with McCarthyism and the like, and it has been resurging in a slightly different form over the last few years. Instead of decrying Russia as the big enemy that shows why communism is so bad, it's been shifted to scapegoat any policies, people, or movements that go against the status quo in America as the reason why we have the problems that we have. This has also led to a serious degradation of certain words. In right-wing rhetoric, Marxism is the same thing as Stalinism, communism, postmodernism, or what have you, despite the connections between them being tenuous at best. If you believe that nothing I have said thus far is true, and that the left is pushing a cultural Marxist revolution to take down Western culture as we know it, first, I'd like to congratulate you on getting this far in the video. Secondly, stick with me. I'm going to break down the origins of cultural Marxism and try to explain how nonsensical of a term it really is. Even if this is all new information to you, and you don't ascribe the term to its origins, you need to understand the absurdity of the term and the far-right connotations that it dog whistles to. Before I start, I'd like to provide a quote. I'll tell you who said it later, but take a guess. Keep that guess in the back of your head because it'll be important. Bolshevism is not only anti-bourgeois, it is anti-cultural. It means that in the final consequence, the absolute destruction of all economic, social, state, cultural, and civilizing advances made by Western civilization. The term cultural Marxism was born in 1930s Germany to subvert and demonize socialism, progressivism, and the like by claiming that these groups wanted to destroy Germany. Through vague language and constant goalpost shifting, the Nazi leadership turned public sentiment against whoever they wanted with this terminology. It is important to note that the similarity between this Nazi sentiment and modern cultural Marxism does not link the Nazis and today's right-wing leadership directly. What does bridge the gap is the modern conspiracy behind the re-proliferation of the term. In modern times, there are two prominent people who have pushed this terminology the most, being Pat Buchanan and William Lind. The politically active among you might recognize these names, as they have both been prominent Republican advisors and donors for several decades. Buchanan was adamant that these vague Marxists were trying to de-Christianize America, and Lind claimed that colleges were becoming ivory-covered North Koreas. Their rhetoric demonized political correctness and other left-wing beliefs as accelerating the destruction of Western tradition and culture. William Lind has done the most to define this term, linking it back to a group of Jewish German philosophers who fled the Nazis in 1930, and who were all members of the Frankfurt School of Thought. It is not entirely disingenuous to call this school of thought Marxist, but this school did produce the retrospective philosophy of critical theory, and not all of its members identified with Marx's ideals. The closest association that the Frankfurt School as a whole has to Marxism is that some of its members questioned unregulated capitalism's effect on human lives. In modern conservative rhetoric, the ominous cultural Marxists in the left are demonizing our culture. According to conservatives, they're trashing our religions, pushing degeneracy in art and media, and indoctrinating people into radical beliefs. This phrasing would not be out of place in a Trump speech, but it was actually Theodor Adorno, who is credited as the main proponent of critical theory and the Frankfurt School, who first said these things in the book Dialectic of Enlightenment. The only difference is that Adorno does not blame a nebulous group of progressives and neo-Bolsheviks for this power washing of culture, but instead questions capitalist pandering to human base instincts with the hyper-sexualization of advertising and media. Adorno and his ilk did not want to tear down modern society. They wanted a return to Enlightenment ideals of rationalism and personal freedom, and criticized the ways that capitalism was detrimental to these values. Claiming that communism can be brought about through politically correct cultural changes is even contradictory to Marxism, which understands that communism is only achievable through changing economic relationships between individual people. The notion of the cultural Marxist boogeyman is rooted in nonsense and not at all in reality, but it is still useful to the right. It represents an effort to push fascist, ethnocentric rhetoric into everyday parlance, as well to you, the average Joe who has just been whipped into a fear of communism. The phrase cultural Marxist might not mean much more than that, fear, but the groups and the people behind the phrase take it to the extremes. The Frankfurt School's makeup was mostly Jewish, and multiple far-right ideologues from Pat Buchanan and William Lind to the more modern examples of Richard Spencer and the like have declared, sometimes openly but most often implicitly, that cultural Marxism and political correctness as a Jewish cabal's conspiracy to undermine white Christian America. By the way, that previously unsourced quote I provided was directly from a speech by Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels, and it matches up perfectly with modern conservative rhetoric used to demonize the left and progressive groups. Utilizing the rhetoric of these groups, however innocuously you may define it, is flirting with fascist rhetoric and should not be a path that any reasonable person ever starts down.